and I'm going to talk about the Buddhist Stupa, Journey along the Silk Road. Now this is a very familiar journey and one that's been discussed by several scholars before me, and there's quite an accepted, clear narrative about this. I want to give you that and then raise some of the issues that I think we still have over this narrative and over many of the narratives, in fact most of the narratives of the Silk Road. As John says, it's an immensely complex place, and complexity is fun, but it doesn't lend itself to simple narratives. So I will talk about this journey of the Buddhist Stupa along the Silk Road and then discuss on the way some of the issues with the story I'm giving. Oh, I can give a book plug as well, since you gave me a book plug. Life on the Silk Road. I'm just doing a new edition, so I've just submitted a new edition with 2 new chapters in to show a bit more of that complexity. Well, since we're talking about the Silk Road, we should just define it, and you'll find as many definitions or variations on the definition, and a lot of discussion about whether it is a useful concept. There's some interesting work being done now by Tamara Chin at Chicago on this, and on the original concept by Rick Tover in 1877, and the idea and the concept of the Silk Road since then. I'm not going to get into that discussion today, although I'm happy to talk about it later in questions. But just for the sake of having a definition, because we are using this concept, I would say sustained long-distance trade routes across Eurasia by land and sea, and I think we can't separate out the maritime and the land routes, connecting Central Asia with China, India, and the Middle East, Rome, and Africa. So Central Asia is at the hub of this definition. That's the importance. There was long-distance trade since the beginning of human history. There's been long-distance trade. There's been long-distance trade across Eurasia. We only have to look at the existence of lapis in Egyptian tombs from the 2nd millennium BC. Lapis comes from eastern Afghanistan, from Badakhshan, travelled along the Silk Road. Jade in China, also in the 1st millennium BC, comes from Khotan, Pertian, in the western Taklamakan, travelled long distance across Eurasia. The difference, what seems to make it distinctive about the Silk Road, is this sustained long-distance trade across this Central Asian barrier. And it's an area we're going to be looking at today. And starting at the end of the 2nd, beginning of the 1st century BC. Now, what this did do, this opening of these long-distance trade routes, was enable the movement, of course, of not only peoples, but everything that people carry along with them. Which not only trade goods, their ideas, philosophies, religions, cultures, technologies, military skills, a whole lot of other things. This is a very nice map done by Matthew Cholik in Australia, where he's said, well, it's a map that anybody can contribute to. It's just trying to collect together monastic Buddhist monasteries throughout the world. The map does cover other parts of the world. I've just shown you the part of the Eurasia we're going to be talking about today. And you can see very clearly these clusters of Buddhist institutions, Buddhist monasteries, rising up, coming up through India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and then around to the Taklamakan. You can see very clearly this movement and the routes punctuated by these monasteries. This is a simpler map of that, showing how Buddhism is normally thought to have spread, going up from its homeland in India through Central Asia, westward and eastward, and there's been a bit more work done over the past decade on the westward movement of Buddhism, but especially the eastern movement through the Taklamakan and into China and through Southeast Asia. what this map doesn't show is, although it has maritime routes coming from the east coast of India, Sri Lanka, to here, there were routes going all the way through to China from early times as well. And so Buddhism also came around into East Asia, all the way around here. It's something that there's a maritime Silk Road Buddhist project going on at the moment, which is looking at this in more detail. Just evidence of maritime routes, and there's lots of evidence, but one piece of evidence, this is a Hellenistic piece of glass made in the 3rd, 2nd century BC. Very beautiful piece of blue glass. It doesn't show well because of aging, but that was found in near Canton. Was found in a tomb here, 2nd, 1st century BC tomb. Almost certainly came by sea from the borders of the Mediterranean. So we know there were sea routes as well, and Buddhism was coming in this way, but it's not something I'm going to be concentrating on today. But again, it's this idea of keeping this complexity in mind and this constant interaction of the different routes and different ways, ideas and peoples are travelling. Now, I always think it's interesting to look at architecture travelling, because architecture tends to be more conservative than it's easy to take a small piece of pottery, and quite easy to produce pottery. Material culture, there's lots of issues about why it might not be adopted by other cultures, or why it is adopted. But of this, architecture is there's many more issues, just because of the investment in monumental architecture such as this. The investments of funds, of people, of skills required to produce it. So it requires much more a commitment of the place where it's built to its production. And so if we see architecture in a place, we can make certain assumptions about it. Certainly something like a stupa, which is a place for Buddhist ritual. It would have been, originally stupas, of course, were built with to house the relics of the Buddha. And we see here stupa with the Ashokan pillars, so from about 3rd century BC, when the Emperor Ashoka is said to have distributed the relics and had these columns built throughout northern India and into Central Asia. So the relics would have been kept in the centre of the stupa, and it would have been a place for ritual and worship. So it would have had to have formed the basis of, there would have had to have been a large community there to build it, to get the funds for its building, and to maintain it and keep the ritual and the worship going. Of course, like medieval churches, stupas today look rather austere, but they would have been festooned with colourful silk, strewn with, many of them would have been gilded, there'd been wealth for that, strewn with semi-precious stones. And tomorrow, when I'm speaking, I'm going to talk a bit more about the whole idea of what we can learn from Buddhism and from architecture and Buddhist art and archaeology, what it tells us about trade on the Silk Road. But I won't cover that so much today. So we see these stupas from the time of King Ashoka, from 3rd century BC, and they become ubiquitous over northern India. This is Sanchi again from 3rd to 1st centuries BC, a very famous site, obviously quite heavily restored. And then we get to other sites, moving up the Gandharan Valley. And you can start to see that the stupas become much higher. Originally they said they were upturned alms bowls, the alms bowl of the Buddha. So they were modelled on the upturned alms bowls. But within a century or two, they start becoming much taller, verticalization. And as well as having round bases, many of them start being built on square bases. And these bases become terraced and more complex, often with stairways on either side. So this verticalization and complexity of the bottom of the terraces, bottom of the stupas happens 2nd, 1st centuries BC, as the stupa form is moving into Gandhara, into Central Asia. Here's another one, and you can see quite clearly here the colonnades that have been built on the square terrace base. This quite tall bottom terrace with stupa on top. And these were excavated in the early part of the 20th century by Marshall and others in this region. And in fact, this was meant to be a reconstruction of what the original stupa would have looked like. So much, much taller than the early stupas with this base. This doesn't show, there are these colonnades all around the stupa, but of course it doesn't show the fact that there were also statues within these colonnades. Most of them no longer extant, so most of them missing. So quite complex buildings, requiring also sculptures to build on them, to build these, to fashion these sculptures around the bases in the colonnades. And also artists, because often they would have a circumambulatory around, which corridors to circumambulate, which would have been painted with scenes from the life of the Buddha. But again, very few of those are extant. And just to show another stupa going again, this is in the Swat Valley now. Previously we were on the Indus, so we're moving northwards up through this area into Central Asia, the route that the Silk Road followed, or the trade routes across from India into what is now Western China followed. This is in the Swat Valley, again a stupa that was first excavated and recorded in the early part of the 20th century by Stein, and has recently been excavated and documented by Italian archaeologist who's doing a lot of work in this region. But again, you can see there's quite complex stairways with stairways going up each side, and there might have been entrances to the stupa on all sides, and very much more verticalized dome. So far we've been looking at coming up through the Indus Valley and then into this region here, through the Indus Valley and into this region around Gandhara, Taxila, this area here. But we see stupas throughout this region. There are numerous remains. Of course, there was lots of excavation done of them and lots of recording done of them in the late 19th, early 20th century, when this region became much more accessible to archaeologists. The Archaeological Survey of India did lots of work in the area, and other archaeologists then started moving into Central Asia after the rapprochement between Britain and Russia and the end of the Great Game. And so we have a lot of records from the early part of the 20th century. More recently, it's become more difficult again to excavate in this area, so we rely a lot on these historical records of the early archaeologists. And this obviously has its limitations in our understanding today, because we could really need to carry out more systematic surveys of this region, but it's very difficult to do so in order to understand what's going on. But we see these stupas all the way along the routes through the mountains. Now this is very mountainous territory, Hindu Kush, Karakoram and Pamir, and so the routes are limited by the mountain passes, the navigable mountain passes. So there's a limited number of routes, and we see Buddhism going along these routes quite clearly until it crosses the passes and comes down into the western Taklamakan desert here. And this is the area to look at. Of course, This movement of the stupas into this area happened in the centuries, 3rd to 1st centuries BC, but by the 1st to 3rd centuries AD, one of the, I would say, key factors in the formation and the growth of the Silk Road, of trade, of cultures moving across this region, was the rise of the Kushan Empire in Central Asia. As I've said, if we think about Central Asia as being central to the Silk Road, with routes going north, south, east, west from this, having the whole area for the first time within political control and as in a stable political state, with a regime that might not have been Buddhist, but it looked kindly on Buddhism and merchants and allowed their safe passage through from down into the Indian seaports, especially from the mouth of the Indus, and then, as I said, north to the Sogdiana, one of the great trading nations, trading city-states, the Sogdians, and then west into West Asia, Parthia and Sasanian, Persia, and east into the Tarim Basin. So it allowed this movement and this growth in the trade routes. So it allowed, as I said, this movement into the Tarim Basin, into the east of this region. I just put the map up to show you that this is indeed a desert region we're talking about, and so routes here couldn't go straight through the centre. Obviously, they had to follow north and south, the oasis kingdoms, the oases of on the north and southern fringes of the desert. Who's been to the Taklamakan? Any of you been there? Oh my, most of you, so you know exactly what it's like. I used to do these lectures 20 years ago, nobody had been to these places. Now it's, so have you been to Kashgar, Khotan, northern and southern? Yeah, oh well, you all know what it's like then. So, Khotan, Kuchar, Turpan Basin and Kashgar around here, all cultures allowed by the meltwater from the mountains, from the Kunlun to the south and the Tian Shan to the north and the Pamir to the west. Already, you know, there's cultures and evidence of peoples in this region from the 3rd millennium BC. It wasn't a desert in terms of culture. It's a very important area in terms of its links, in terms of its roots to the great civilizations, to the great empires on its boundaries. Yet it's often a forgotten area because it's often seen as the sort of gap in between, or peripheral. We think in world systems as a sort of peripheral area. And I must say, my instincts militate against that, and I think it needs a bit more, bit of promotion. So bear in mind that places like Khotan, of course, were a kingdom which lasted for 1,000 years, substantial in size, with its own language, its own culture, its own form of Buddhism, and yet there isn't a single monograph on the history of Khotan. If we consider the number of monographs on the history of small European nations that lasted only a few hundred years, it shows the sort of state of scholarship in this area and how much there remains to be done, which is part of the story that I want to talk about today. So by the time we're talking about, by the beginning of the 1st millennium, when the Kushans came to power, and over the next few centuries, we know of various Taklamakan kingdoms, that some were formed already and some came into being over this time. One of the earliest, probably 1st to 3rd century, but maybe earlier than that, was Karena, which stretched from the Lop Desert in the east all the way to near, right on the borders of what's Khotan. Khotan, as I said, sorry, rather obviously squares. These kingdoms weren't squares, but just to show them. Shula around Kashgar, and this was very important because it had very close links with the Kushans. There were links between the royal families. of Kashgar and Kushan, so we know there are a lot of links, and in fact historians used to think that the Kushan Empire extended into the Taklamakan. That's not so much the thought now, but it certainly had influence in this area, and that's important for our story. Kuchar, and then Turfan, and then further to the east on the sort of borders of much more the Chinese cultural area, Dunhuang. So when Buddhism and the monks and the merchants started moving along the newly opened routes, or newly stabilized routes, across the mountains into this area, they encountered existing cultures, existing peoples. Karena, just to give a quick example, I have to show you a manuscript because I do work with manuscripts daily, so we can't even talk just about stupas without showing a manuscript or two. Karena, of course, used, and it shows that the links again with Central Asia, used the Kharoshthi script, a Central Asian script, but to write Gandhari Prakrit, so the language of Gandhari. So quite clearly showing its close links with this culture across the mountains. This was found at a place called Nia. And although most of the documents we have from these places are secular, this is another document from Nia, they do show evidence by this time of Buddhism. So this one, for example, a translation talks about a monk, certainly a Buddhist monk, and it also talks about quite a lot of goods. So rolls of silk, and it also talks about wine further down. I'm not sure where it's in this slide here. So we know by this time that certainly there were Buddhist communities here, even if we don't have many Buddhist documents. We have Buddhist architecture, we don't have Buddhist documents from this particular region. We know that Buddhism was entrenched in the community by this time, and that the community was also getting goods from outside the area. Silk would have come in at this time from China. Wine, of course, a Silk Road import into the area, although Nia was a great wine growing region by this time, with immense vineyards or large vineyards producing its own grapes and its own wine. So we have to look, it's always the case, of course, with doing history where the evidence is patchy. We have to rely on the archaeological evidence, the textual evidence, material evidence, but all of it is very patchy, and so we're trying to fill in the gaps in order to tell the narrative, and of course therein lies the rub. Here, this kingdom in the west of Karena, apart from the mention of Buddhism in the documents, there are also two stupas being found, one from about 100 years ago, uncovered by Orlstein, shown here, more recent photograph obviously, and another more recently found by Sino-Japanese excavations on a square base, although the actual stupa, the top of the stupa, edifice of the stupa is no longer extant, as in base left. And Stein also identified a monastery, a potential monastery at the site, but these are the only brick buildings there are. The rest of the architecture is wooden, using the then ubiquitous poplar, now sand, but the river used to go through there, so it was once quite an oasis area. Just put up a very famous slide again through what art is left, what remains left. We can see quite clearly the Gandhara influence as well on this wood carving here, wood carving now in New Delhi in the National Museum there, but excavated by Stein in the early 20th century. If we go to another site in Karena, this 1st to 4th century kingdom on the south of the Silk Road, again this is Miran, and we see many stupas here. This is just one of them in the centre of the site. Again, the picture taken during 100 years ago when it was being excavated. And it's one that had art around the corridor, paintings around the corridor, and again we see this very close link in terms of style with the Gandharan region. But these are just a few remnants of what's a few remnants. There's very little art left, but there's quite a lot of structure, certainly of Miran. What we don't know, though, is the exact dating of these things, and this makes the story very difficult. So while we see stupas and stupas that are of the same type of those in Gandhara, we don't know whether they're of the same time or whether they come later. And there's actually no consensus on the dating of a lot of these objects. I just put this up because for those of you who are interested, we've got an online exhibition at the moment showing these before and after pictures of stupas and other sites in the desert. So you can see quite clearly how little has changed over the 100 years since they were excavated by Stein, and this was taken in 2008, more or less 100 years later. But we have a special section on stupas, so there's lots of pictures of these desert stupas. But we see the same process happening in the Taklamakan, basically, as we see in Gandhara. We see this verticalization. There's a couple of early stupas on a round base, but most of them, by the time in Tarim, are on a square basis. They're higher. You get verticalization. Almost all have been robbed, so there's no relics left, unfortunately. And getting on more and more complex bases. This is Endere, again in the kingdom of Karena. So again, probably 1st to 4th centuries, although dating is uncertain, and most scholars would put it to the later part of that date. I'm going to talk instead a bit more tomorrow about trade and what we can learn from Buddhism about trade. But of course, it's very unfortunate that we've lost all the relics from the stupas, because they would have given us quite a lot of information about the movement and the production of goods in this region, especially as relics often came together, relics of the Buddha often came together with treasures such as semi-precious stones, which came from brought from outside the Taro. And the use of glass, it should be said, and crystal, but glass and crystal also very important, and the whole story of glass is something I'll look at a bit more tomorrow. Of course, we do have some relics left in a few in Chinese stupas, but these are in China. This is Farman Si near Xi'an, the famous relics of the Buddha's finger bone, in, again, crystal caskets, crystal and jade caskets, moving up to gold, cloth-covered gold caskets. So that's Karena, and we know this kingdom lasted about the 1st to the 4th centuries, and we know that by the time Fa Xian, the Buddhist monk who travelled there in the late 4th, early 399 onwards, late 4th, early 5th centuries, talks a lot about a lot of those Quranic sites being now deserted because of changes in the water table or changes in the course of rivers, movements and population, silting up the irrigation canals, various reasons that I'm going to go into here. And there's, again, many, many theories about that, and no absolute consensus. But from the 4th century, we do start, late 4th, early 5th century, start getting more first-hand textual evidence of travellers. And this is Fa Xian route in a very nice, I don't know whether you all know this map. This is Google map representation of Fa Xian's route. You can click on all these areas and find out more about it. This is done by Victorian Art Museum, so it's on their site. But you can see he went around Taklamakan, up through the Lop to Kuchar, and then across the desert route, across through the Khotan River down to Khotan, and then across to Tashgurkhan and down the valley to all these Gandharan sites, spending a long time there visiting Buddhist sites and talking about their general state. This was the time when Buddhism, of course, was declining in this area, but not in Tarim. So we see certainly by the 3rd, 4th centuries, if not before, a lot of stupas in this area. So we'd expect to see a lot of stupas in Kashgar, a lot of Buddhism, because of its close links with Khotan. The trouble is with Kashgar, its remains are rather fragmentary. There's been a lot more building going on there, more modern building, and although there are a lot more development over the centuries, and although there are remains of some stupas, such as more Retinan places which show the same sort of style, there are fewer. We come to Khotan now. Well, that's that's just another. Oh, that's Subashi actually. Yeah, again we see it's up there, up in Turfan. So again we see these the same forms of stupas all the way along the Tarim. Again, quite a vertical stupa on a square basis. And here Rawak in Khotan, with this square base with staircases going up each side. Very, very similar to the stupa we looked at earlier in the Indus Valley format. Khotan was, Rawak stupa was surrounded by perimeter walls which had sculptures all the way around them, inside and out. Hundreds of sculptures, all of which unfortunately are more or less lost now. Been lost over the past century. This again is a photograph taken by Stein in the early part of the 19th century. But again showing how these stupas would have been very highly decorated. And then again, coming to Turfan, we see more and more massive style stupas over this period. But really we're talking about a very period of a couple of 100 years here, and all these forms arising more or less at the same time, from what we can tell. There's not a clear progression or an absolute progression from one to the other. They all seem to emerge quite quickly, and different stupas, types of stupas, styles of stupas are built contemporaneously at sites. But we do start to see this much more massive tower stupa. This is at Yarhoto Jauha, just to the west of Turfan, and here it's Soka, again just near the present-day city of Turfan. Massive style stupa with these colonnades for which would have originally been filled, we presume, with Buddha figures, even though they're not none are left anymore, none remain. There are a few being found at other sites. And these replicate stupas or descriptions of stupas we have in Gandhara. So again, we're seeing this transmission across, we believe, from Gandhara to the Tarim during this first few centuries AD. Now, following the fall of the Kushan in the 3rd, 4th centuries, doesn't seem to have made a great deal of difference to the transmission and the rise of the development of Buddhism in this area here, the Western regions. It in fact flourishes over that time. We have more and more records from that time, especially of Buddhist monks travelling to the region, more other textual records, a lot more, starting to get some local textual records, not just ones coming in from travellers coming from outside, and a lot more architectural and archaeological evidence from that period. At the same time, we see the rise of the Northern Wei dynasty in northern China and their control of the routes west into this region. And this is the time that, of course, Buddhism, although it's come into China before, but really starts to take root in northern China. Now, I'm not going to talk much about the stupa in China. It has been covered by many more people before, and everybody thinks of the stupa in China as a very traditional pagoda type, which becomes sinicized by taking on traditional Chinese wooden architecture with repeated roof tiles, eaves like this, and wooden brackets and wooden style architecture construction, which of course wasn't only used in China. There was wooden architecture used along the Tarim and India as well, but certainly there was a move towards the or a preference for the very vertical stupas with lots of colonnades showing Buddhas, such as here. But the trouble is, with our evidence for China, this is one of the things that we have to be aware about when telling this story, is that we have very, very little left from this time. We have a few models. So this on the left is a model of a stupa found in Gansu in the Hershey Corridor from the early 5th century, showing these tiers. And then we have many paintings and models of stupas in the caves, Northern Wei caves that were built in Datong to the north and then near Luoyang when they moved their capital, from the 5th and 6th centuries. The earliest brick-built stupa in China, again Northern Wei, is sort of this one at Songyue, and again it shows this quite massive form with repeated tiers. But you can see in this this clear link to the Tarim and the Central Asian style coming through into China. Just to show a couple of the ones here, his long one with the cave 9 with the stupa shown here, with these tiers, with the colonnades, with the Buddha statue in, cave 51. Again, very similar to this one here, with multiple tiers of Buddhas, and then it was already starting to get the wooden roof eaves going up and separating out each of the registers of the stupa. And again, as said, in China we do get some stupas where we have reliquaries, so we can learn a bit more about the whole Buddhist practice and trade and everything from that. I just showed this picture. This is Farman Temple near Xi'an, the one that we looked at the reliquaries from earlier, because it shows something of the internal construction. This is just before it fell down and revealed the underground chamber where the reliquaries were found, with all the jewels. This, of course, is the Wild Goose Pagoda in Xi'an, built on the orders of Xuanzang when he returned from his trip to India, and asked the emperor to build him a stupa. Now this exemplifies the problem really, because we look at this, and although it does bear resemblance, again you've got these tiers, you've got quite the massive form like the Central Asian and Gandhara tower stupas, but it's already taking on a much more Chinese style. But this isn't the original stupa that was built by Xuanzang. Xuanzang's stupa, he wanted it built on the style of the stupa of King Kanishka in Central Asia that he'd seen on his travels. Unfortunately, no longer extant, although its foundations have been identified. But it was quite a massive, probably much more of a massive tower stupa. But we know that within a few years of its building, or within a couple of decades of its building, in the Chinese then capital of Chang'an, there were trees coming out from the sides. So obviously it was quite a massive stupa with an earthen core, which gave rise to, still had tree seeds in it, which started to affect the structure. So it was knocked down and rebuilt, and then there were earthquakes, and it was knocked down and rebuilt again. So what we have left in China is a much later legacy on the whole of stupas. So it's very difficult to make, to get a coherent and clear story, to get the weight of evidence about what's happening. And I say that in China, but even more so in the Tarim. So I just wanted to raise a couple of issues. I'm just going to end on this, because we have here a story of Buddhism and Buddhist architectural practices and forms coming up into Gandhara, crossing into the eastern Silk Road of the oases of the Taj and taking root there, being copied there, presumably by some of the architects who came across, or some of the monks, obviously requiring a big investment of energy and funds and skills, and then moving over the following centuries into China. Now, Zerker, Eric Zerker, a very famous, respected scholar, of course, challenged this whole idea. He argued that, in fact, when Buddhism came into China, East Asia, from Gandhara, it passed through a desert, a wasteland, that there was no Buddhism before 250 in the Tarim. And he was basing this on the dates, recorded dates of the stupas, the archaeological remains in the Tarim, of what evidence there was. I would say this exemplifies really where we're at with Silk Road studies. What happens is that we tell narratives, we have to tell narratives as historians, but there are so many gaps in our understanding, so many gaps in our evidence, that we have to fill in those gaps with a coherent narrative, but they are very open to being reassessed. We're not at the stage yet where we can be completely sceptical about this idea of the Tarim as a Buddhist desert before 250. But I think there's reasonable evidence from the remains there, from the down to about some of their datings, to suggest that maybe Buddhism did take root, and there were substantial Buddhist communities, certainly in the kingdom of Karena and Khotan and Kashgar in the first few centuries AD. As I said, we're looking at these early stupas, and some historians put them to the first, second centuries. Stein certainly tended to put the datings a bit earlier than more recent historians who tended to put them to 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. But they betoken by the time you get architectural forms such as a stupa, it necessitates quite a large community of believers and a substantial investment by that community in this building for worship and ritual. And it wasn't a building that just sat there and merchants came by every 50 years or so, every 10 years. It was a building that had constant ritual and worship and was the centre of a community. And a Buddhist stupa, I'm sure there's been work done, I know there's been work done on India and the social settings of Buddhist stupas in India, in North India, does require as I said, that substantial community, substantial wealth in the community to build and maintain a stupa. And again, where that wealth comes from is something I'll be looking at tomorrow. And to see these early stupas in the 3rd century as arising from sudden influx of population as Zerker does in the 3rd century, giving rise to this massive building program taking place over the next century or two. I think now it's time to re-evaluate that. I'm not coming here today to give you any firm conclusions. I'm coming here today to say I'm in a state of scepticism about this, but I'm in a state of scepticism about everything on the Silk Road. So that's just the state you get to after 20 years of studying it. You think you know everything and you realise, well, no, you don't think you know everything. You think you can learn everything, it's possible to learn everything. And the more you learn, the more you're sceptical about everything you've learned and about how much there is to learn. But I do think, I said my instincts, and as scholars we all go by instincts, even though we have to back them up by evidence, my instincts tell me that in fact we need to re-evaluate this, and instead of seeing this as a very peripheral region to the development of Buddhism in these early centuries, and to the transmission of Buddhism between the Gandharan and the East Asian Chinese worlds, and through them the other Korean and Japan and it will in 10 or 20 years' time take its place as much more of an influential area. So I'm going to leave you on that, to say we've seen the transmission of the stupa, we've seen this clear progression. We know very little about how that progression happens, about the time frame it takes place in, about the different strands of that progression. And while you might read nice, and we all might read nice chronological narratives, they're misleading, and we need to keep open minds about all that, and to reevaluate some of these areas that have been